Since Taylor dropped her highly anticipated double album, the response has been extremely mixed. Reviews are all over the place. Social media is completely divided. It seems that the album is viewed as one of her best by a lot of Swifties, and one of her worst by the general public. If you've been on social media since the album's release, I'm sure you've seen a ton of TikToks, tweets, and reactions criticizing the album. But social media is an echo chamber. It's obviously important to note that the Tortured Poets department is breaking records left, right, and center, and this is by far the most successful album launch in streaming history. And its numbers are pretty stable. So enough of the general public is paying attention to it, streaming it, and buying record numbers of physical copies. Also important to note that basically every Taylor Swift album has received mixed feedback at first. Red was criticized for lack of cohesion and not being as diaristic as her country albums. 1989 was criticized for abandoning country music completely. Reputation received extremely negative feedback and only became heavily praised years later. Lover was criticized for being bloated and her weakest pop album. Midnights was dubbed Midnights on social media and got a lot of critique, including for songs being too similar, which Tortured Poets is now being knocked for. Even Folklore and Evermore got pushed back for lack of bops, particularly on Stan Twitter, who nicknamed the albums Folklore and Eversnore. So, a Taylor album taking a while to be appreciated is the normal trajectory, and could be what will happen here. Today, I want to explore why the reaction to the Tortured Poets department has been so polarized, especially in comparison to an album like Lover, which was widely considered weak by both her fans and the general public. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, why people are divided, and what I think the reputation of Taylor's music will be going forward. Just to preface, I am personally a big fan of this album. I like Taylor's slow and verbose songs best, so this, Folklore, and Evermore are my top 3, but I'm going to put my biases to one side. Firstly, there is definitely plenty of valid criticism of this album. It was one of her most mysterious album launches. She didn't really give anyone much to go on, so expectations and predictions were varied, and of course, a sizable amount of people were bound to be left disappointed. Because of the Victorian aesthetic she's been going for, and the branding of this album as being related to poetry, I think most people expected a more classic sound, and many were understandably disappointed to hear more synth-pop, especially after the synth-pop sound of her previous studio album Midnights in 2022, and the Taylor's version of 1989 last year, which is obviously also a synth-pop album. I think a lot of people were hoping for a radically new sound, like when Folklore dropped, and Taylor isn't sonically touching new ground here. Many have blamed this lack of evolution on Taylor releasing music too quickly, comparing her discography to Marvel movies. But I don't think this specific criticism works. At the Eras Tour, Taylor implied pretty heavily that all of the re-recordings were finished quite a while ago and are just waiting to be released, with the notable exception of the yet-to-be-released Reputation, which Taylor couldn't begin re-recording until late 2022. When you factor out the Taylor's version albums, then you have a synth-pop album, Midnights, which was predominantly made in 2021, and then a partially synth-pop album Tortured Poets, which was predominantly made over the following 2 years. Taylor did say that she started Tortured Poets right after finishing Midnights, which might be why there is some overlap in sound, especially in the songs early in the tracklist. But Midnights and Tortured Poets ended up being finished 18 months apart, which is not unusual whatsoever by modern pop standards. Even the idea that Taylor's best work takes longer is pretty questionable. If you think albums like her country stuff, or pure pop stuff like 1989, Reputation, and Lover are her best, then fair enough, but generally most people agree that Folklore and Evermore are Taylor's best work, and they were each made in only a few months. In the wider music industry, we see this trend too. Taking Ariana as an example, Thank You Next was famously made in 2 weeks and is undoubtedly an incredibly strong album. And in my opinion, much more strong than an album that took years like Positions, which had very strong highlights but was more of a mixed bag. Lyrically, Tortured Poets is a mixed bag too. I actually do think there are certain songs which are up there as some of Taylor's best work, like So Long London, Guilty as Sin, or LOML. Conceptually, Taylor comes up with new ideas that are really interesting, like in Clara Bow, where she discusses the systematic replacement of women in the music industry as they age, and the manipulation of younger girls as they enter, Or how did it end where she compares the demand for answers about why a breakup happened to society collectively waiting for the results of a postmortem, desperately trying to find out the details of why someone or something died? However, there are obvious lyrics throughout the album which are cringy or clunky or just bad. To be honest, one that I have to defend is the Grand Theft Auto line. It's obviously a little on the cringy side, but because the concept of the song is high school and being so in love that you act a little cringy, I think it's forgivable. There was also backlash over the 1830s, but without all the racist line. Obviously, there were people just making fun of it. But then there were people actually saying that the line is offensive, leading to a counter backlash from people on the political right defending Taylor. I think the line is kinda comparable to the sexy baby line in Anti-Hero, in the sense that it's pretty clunky and distracting. But you have to really be reaching to say it's offensive, especially since everyone I personally saw criticizing the line took it out of context of what the song's about, and the fact that it's from the perspective of a child. And of course, there's also the second verse and the title track. I understand what Taylor was going for here. The whole concept of the song is her refuting the idea that they are tortured poets, instead saying they are modern idiots because they're high and talking nonsense. But the execution of that concept is really bad here and very distracting from what I think is an otherwise good song. Again, this isn't really a unique experience for Taylor. Literally every single album she puts out has some awkward lyric that sounds out of place and is off-putting for casual listeners. It's clearly something she's either unaware of or just doesn't care about when writing. And seeing that she is capable of truly beautiful and poetic songwriting, it is pretty frustrating that she won't just make an album filled with that. But this kind of brings me to my main point. As much as the people criticizing this album say that Taylor is failing to move in a new direction, she actually has, just not in the way we expected. For the last few years, particularly due to Folklore, the re-recordings and the Eras tour, Taylor has been insanely overexposed. She has reached levels of popularity that many didn't think were possible in the modern age. In terms of media attention, sales, streaming, touring, she's beating everyone, and it's not even close. Factors outside of her control, like college courses teaching lessons on her work, the TikTok trend comparing her lyrics to Shakespeare, and the NFL's relentless focus on her, has led to expectations on Taylor being higher and higher to a point that is probably unattainable. High expectations lead to extreme reactions, like some people who didn't like Tortured Poets saying it is her worst album, which is, in my opinion, a pretty ridiculous statement. Although music is somewhat subjective, I think it's basically impossible to argue that certain albums like Debut are a better body of work. However, is Tortured Poets a great body of work? No. I actually think Taylor was incredibly on the nose in describing it as an anthology, because it's not really a body of work at all. If we consider a good album to be a clear and concise body of work, then that's not Tortured Poets, and it's not what it's trying to be. Albums like Eternal Sunshine are cohesive and tell a coherent story. Albums like Cowboy Carter are a tribute to a variety of sounds. Tortured Poets is a self-described manic stream of consciousness, where Taylor rambles and exposes every thought she went through during this troubled period of her life, and that even leads to her unapologetically presenting herself as cringeworthy, in the wrong, or unlikable at times. This truly is a quintessentially Taylor Swift album. It's rambling, it's overly dramatic, it's verbose and it's petty, but it's honest and it's emotionally unapologetic in a way we haven't really seen from Taylor since Speak Now. And I think this is why the reaction has been so mixed. Critics of the album have compared it and her music generally to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And by that, they mean a quantity over quality attitude, overexposed, reliance on knowing the existing lore, and a focus on commercial success rather than creativity. On the quantity over quality point, like I said, I don't think that stands up. Considering the re-recordings are already done, she isn't really producing music much faster than she ever has before. She's still following her typical gap of roughly 2 years, and the one time she was actually faster than that, she ended up making the 2 best albums of her career. So if you think her music quality has declined or become repetitive, that's not why. And I also think that refutes the focus on commercial success angle. What this really comes down to is 2 things: the amount of tracks per album increasing and overexposure. Some have argued that through the release of vault tracks, Taylor now has an attitude of including everything she makes on albums, and that she should not have released 31 tracks for Tortured Poets, and instead should have filtered them down into a cohesive album. I think it is important to note that Tortured Poets isn't a 31-track album. It's a double album with 16 tracks on one and 15 tracks on the other. There's a difference. People said 31 tracks is too many to listen to in one sitting, but no one held a gun to anyone's head and forced them to do that. They're separate and were released separately and not designed to be listened to as one album. People said she should have cut down the 31 tracks, but there doesn't seem to be any agreement whatsoever on what songs should have been cut. When I see people's ranking of these songs, it's extremely varied. And this also goes against the argument that the songs are all too similar. I think a big part of the reason why people thought that is because they listened to all 31 in one sitting. And naturally, you won't remember each one distinctly, and they will start to blend together. Upon further listening, you start to appreciate the nuances and differences between tracks. There are synth pop tracks like Fortnight and Down Bad, upbeat bangers like I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, beautiful piano ballads like How Did It End or Peter, and country and western influences on songs like I Can Fix Him and Who's Afraid of Little Old Me. There are plenty of different production ideas going on in this album, and maybe they could have been more pronounced. But Taylor does tend to go for extremely cohesive albums. As much as some critics are saying these songs sound too similar, I think there is a retconning of history going on, and people seem to forget that the exact same thing was said about Lover, Folklore, Evermore, and Midnights. I was there when all of these albums dropped, and they were all criticized for repetitiveness. The release week of Midnights was brutal. But now, I'm seeing more love for Midnights than I've seen since it released. This is the normal pattern for Taylor albums. She drops. People say it's overly cohesive. The next album drops. People pretend they always loved the first one. When her next album releases, I bet there will be so much love and praise for the Tortured Poets department. It will be like all this criticism never happened. If you don't like this album, that's completely fine and natural. It won't be for everyone. But I don't think it's indicative at all of an objective decline in Taylor's writing. She has produced some of the best songs of her career in the last few years, including on this album. And yes, if you're looking for an album full of bops like 1989, you'll probably prefer her older music. But I don't think it's fair to say that that music was objectively better. What is true is that Taylor's writing has shifted from being equally focused on melodies and lyrics to focusing more on lyrics and making the melody fit around them. Me personally, I love that. If you prefer her older music, it's still there for you to enjoy, but Taylor has already proven herself across the board in terms of writing catchy bops and poetic ballads and everything in between. If you want 1989, go listen to it. If you want Fearless, go listen to it. She doesn't need to repeat them in her new music, and if she did, she would probably get criticism for being stale and won't make everyone happy either way. My personal take is that the maximalist approach Taylor is going for is completely fine. Her releasing a ton of songs and letting people pick their favorites is great if you're a fan of hers, especially since she's notoriously questionable at picking which tracks make the cut of her albums, and letting people choose their favorites is probably the best way to keep her fans happy, considering she has released a range of music, and everyone wants and prefers different things. However, the downfall of this is that for non-fans, she is already completely overexposed, and people are starting to become annoyed by her. Like I said, over the last few years, Taylor has become unimaginably popular. Record-breaking albums, record-breaking tours, being mobbed in public, streaming figures, the NFL, media coverage. It is relentless. She's become so big that the entirety of the general public feels involved. She's not someone that you can just ignore if you don't like her music, because she's unavoidable. And this means that everyone has an opinion. Everyone wants to share it, and Taylor faces pressure to impress not just her fans, but the entire general public. You can't possibly argue that she's underrated. You can't possibly argue that she doesn't have enough people defending her. She's obviously the most popular musician in the world, and someone who Swifties frequently praise for her songwriting. Because there is such an insane amount of hype, a lot of non-fans go into these albums expecting the greatest music of all time, which it obviously isn't going to be. I also don't think Taylor helps herself by putting some of her best work on deluxe versions, in vaults, or in this case, on the anthology where a lot of the general public won't hear it, but whatever. Her fan base itself is so big and vocal that negative discourse around her is deemed completely valid. And to an extent, rightfully so, but it does seem to be spiraling to an unfair point, such as many people pointing out that a lot of the negative reviews of Tortured Poets were centered around the journalist's personal dislike of Taylor, rather than the music. Similarly to Marvel, I think relentless popularity and overexposure does inevitably lead to blowback and possible hate waves. But where I think Taylor differs is she has tried to distance herself from it. Taylor's promotion for each album used to be a lot bigger. Reputation was her shortest tour to date. Lover wasn't even planned to properly tour. Folklore and Evermore were surprise releases with one music video each and very little promotion. Several of the Taylor's version albums came and went with little promotion. And Tortured Poets, although littered with Easter eggs, was relatively tamely rolled out too, with no TV interviews, a single with no remixes or other versions, and so far, only one music video. People pick up on the multiple vinyl variants or announcement of her album at the Grammys, but this is still minimal promotion compared to Taylor's earlier albums like Red or 1989, which people are now asking her to return to. Taylor is extremely popular, but she's not really the one encouraging that. She has written extremely cryptically on Folklore, Evermore, Midnights, and Tortured Poets, reducing speculation over whose songs are about as much as possible considering her popularity. And most importantly, she has now released an album that in every meaningful way is not geared at the general public. It doesn't have many songs at all that could even possibly be smash hits. The rollout is minimal. It's not well suited to touring. The main comparison to Marvel that I think is truly valid is that her work is lore-heavy, and you need to be in deep to fully understand her work. Taylor is one of the only artists who you need to know the lore about to fully comprehend her work, and this leads to a massive disconnect between her fans appreciating the lyrics and the general public not getting it. As I said, if you just want bops, this album and most of Taylor's recent work isn't really directed at you. But even in terms of lyrics, you kinda need to be a hardcore fan to get it. Misunderstood songs like the title track is seen as pretentious by the general public, but funny and tongue-in-cheek by Swifties who are familiar with Taylor's sense of humor. Many songs contain deliberate callbacks or links to previous works, which won't be acknowledged or appreciated by casual listeners. In fact, many of these callbacks have just been dismissed as repetitiveness by music critics and the general public, because they don't understand that Tortured Poets is a conclusion to unfinished themes on all of the Joe albums: Reputation, Lover, Folklore, Evermore, and Midnights. And it's important to note that we've never really seen the impact of re-recording an entire body of work on an artist before, and it totally makes sense that going through the re-recording process would lead to further contemplation of previous themes, such as her elaborating and reconsidering her feelings on Kim Kardashian. And this dependence on lore is, in my opinion, the reason why the reaction to this album has been so polarized. But between deliberately releasing an album that the majority of the general public won't really get, presenting herself as unlikable on songs like Guilty as Sin, where she admits to emotional infidelity, and having a smaller rollout by Taylor's standards, the main purpose of this album is re-establishing a new relationship with not only her fans, but fame itself. Taylor has mentioned her frustration in the past about the pressure early in her career to be seen as a good girl, and she seems to be completely moving away from that. In some ways, she has lost interest in attempting to be seen as relatable, telling the woes of a love life in the public eye, which virtually no one can relate to. Upon first listen, I thought this album was just a messy stream of consciousness, but it's actually a more coherent message than I thought. The key theme linking this whole album together is fame. She compares herself to a toy doll in My Boy only breaks his favorite toys and to a trophy on the bolter. She delivers probably her most brutal take on fame ever, in Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, comparing being a child star to growing up in an asylum, saying that the experience turned her into a meaner and more vicious person, while simultaneously stealing her teeth, a metaphor for her being unable to defend herself from the industry, which she seems to be fighting throughout the album. She openly criticizes her audience's high expectations of her on songs like I Can Do It With a Broken Heart. She acknowledges the destructive nature of being with someone famous like her on songs like The Albatross, but now seems to be accepting it, rather than hiding away and fighting it like she did throughout her relationship with Joe. On The Alchemy, she says, I'm making a comeback to where I belong and seems to be embracing the widespread coverage of her and her status as a superstar, realizing she needs to be with someone who can handle it, rather than hopelessly fighting it. And the key conclusion to this theme of fame comes on the main album's closer, Claire Beau. She discusses being compared to Stevie Nicks when she began her career, and that Stevie was compared to Claire Beau. The song starts off from a young Taylor's perspective, excited and hopeful about making it, and failing to recognize that she was being manipulated by music label executives because of her age. Then, it cuts to grown-up Taylor's perspective, predicting the girl who will replace her in the music industry being manipulated in the same way, and describes this girl's future as dazzling. And this is such a great word choice because it obviously has a positive and glamorous association, but dazzling can also refer to something shining so bright that it's blinding and dangerous. The sound and the message of this album is that Taylor is kinda done with the high expectations put on her and doesn't really care anymore if people criticize her or don't want to be her fans. And this doesn't mean that she doesn't want a strong fan base. Obviously she does, but she seems to be completely over trying to appease the mainstream media and the general public, recognizing it as an impossible task. The reality is, though, most of the general public aren't interested in all this lore. They'll just interpret what Taylor puts out on the surface, read lyrics out of context. Some don't even finish the full album and come to a judgment. And I think the Swifties who are really upset about that should come to the same conclusion as Taylor and just get over it. Because of this divide, this album has ended up, in my opinion, being as misunderstood as Reputation, and I predict that it will similarly be appreciated years from now. I'm already seeing some people start to switch up and say they love it, but either way, Taylor being heavily criticized right now can only be helpful for what is almost certainly her next album, Reputation TV. Now that Taylor has tied up all of the loose ends from the Joe albums, it feels like there is closure on all of these topics. My personal hopes for TS12, which we'll probably get in 2026, is that she does move sonically and lyrically in a new direction, because there doesn't really seem to be ground left to cover here. It's the end of a chapter, and hopefully we can move on to something new.